Scripture today, did you? Today is the day that many churches around the country and around the world are celebrating the Feast of St. Francis, which is actually October 4th. As we know, Francis is the patron saint of animals, and so we have some cat food up here to remind us that usually this time of year we bring in some pet food or pet supplies, and then we donate them wherever they need to be donated. So we'll be doing that next week. But in addition to being St. Francis of Assisi's feast day, it's also World Communion Sunday, and it's also the day that we read the second letter to Timothy. It's not really from Paul, so don't get upset. Most of the stuff that Paul's given credit for, about a half of it's his, and the rest really isn't. But that's not today's sermon, that's another day, so we'll do that some other time. So we have all this stuff going on. It's the Feast of St. Francis. It's World Communion Sunday. It's Timothy's, the second letter to Timothy that we're asked to explore today. And it's like, boom, boom, boom. And I feel like this whole week has been filled with activities like that. It's just a very full week for us. So, what do we say to this? We say, God's Spirit doesn't make cowards of us. We're tough. We stand tough through all that we're asked to do, to spread the good news, and that's what we're going to do today. Now, I know some people often think, because it's St. Francis of Assisi Day, that's the day I tell the sad animal stories and y'all need the Kleenex. Okay? So not to disappoint you, I'm just going to share one story with you today. This is the story of Casey. It actually appeared in a magazine called Mysterious Ways. And the woman who writes the story is the person that is Casey's human, if you will. Okay? And so she said, her name is Carol, and she says, we live in Dalton, Georgia, and Casey is this huge, burly Alaskan Malamute with a heart of gold and a nose for trouble. And so Casey gets in trouble a lot in the neighborhood. And people are coming to her to complain about the things that Casey's done, the appetite Casey's had, the dog food that's been eaten by Casey, even though it wasn't Casey's, and the garbage cans that have been overturned. And so this one day, a man comes to their house and says, are you the persons who own Casey? And Carol, the woman, is thinking to herself, oh no, here it goes. So she says, well, what did Casey do now? And he says, well, we have a sliding glass door we usually keep open in the summer, and every day for the last several weeks, your dog has wandered off the street and come uninvited into our house. So Carol says, I'm sorry, and the person goes on, no, you don't understand. I came over to thank you. The man must have seen the confusion on Carol's face. No neighbor had ever said anything positive about Casey. They usually wanted to know who would fill up the 2-foot hole she'd energetically dug in their backyard, but not this neighbor. He explained that his father, who had Alzheimer's, lived with him and his wife and needed constant monitoring. The father rarely moved from his easy chair in front of the TV and was often agitated. Caring for him had exhausted the man and his wife. I can't remember the last time we had 2 hours to ourselves, the man said. And then one day, your dog showed up. He wandered into the house through the open door and made straight for my father. She sat right there beside him like she had planned to visit him all along. He saw his father turn to Casey and begin to pet her. He stroked her and fell peacefully asleep. He slept 2 full hours, the neighbor said. It was the biggest midday reprieve my wife and I have had in years. Casey returned the next day, and every day after that, as if she had an appointment. Each time was the same. She'd pad to the old man's chair and sit by his side, letting him pet her till he dozed off. To my wife and me, Casey was a gift from heaven. That's why I've come here. Is Casey here? Oh, yes, she is. Casey, and the big Malamute trots out, looks at the neighbor with searching eyes. The neighbor gave her a gentle pat. You must have known, didn't you? That's why you stopped coming 2 days ago. Known what? My father died in his sleep the night after Casey's last visit. She knew her job was over. There are legends about St. Francis, of stories. The legend of how he would tame the birds and they would let him speak to him, and he would, let him speak to them, and he would preach to them, and he would walk among them, and they would light on his arm or his hand. Perhaps you have those statues at your house. We have one inside and one outside. Here's the deal. Both birds broke and fell off, so I'm not sure what the And there's a story about how he tamed the wolf. None of those legends are really true. What we do know is he was a man of peace. He was a man who embraced poverty. He was a very wealthy man that came from a very wealthy family. And he chose to give all that he had back to God. And he died with his beloved monks surrounding him on a cold slab of cement back in the 12th century. And he left us the beautiful peace prayer that we sang earlier today. That's the legacy of Francis. And when we have pets like Casey, that we know Francis would have loved and embraced, it reminds us to celebrate all of them. We have so many meds that we have to give our older guy now at home that some days it takes a long time for me to get him all his medication. And it takes, some of it has to be fed to him orally, and he has to take some of his food and all this kind of stuff. And I was sitting there this morning with the 2 dogs thinking, I am so blessed to have these 2 dogs. Because if I didn't have them, I wouldn't have to be doing all this, and yet my life would be emptier than it is. There's such blessings to us, the pets we have, and I think that's one of the messages of Francis for us. Now, it's World Communion Sunday, which means all over this world, even in places that are hard to imagine, places where all our troops are serving, for example, places where there are Christians, even though overwhelmingly the other religions dominate that culture, people are celebrating that we have a common union. We have a communion in Jesus Christ. It is Jesus Christ who brings us all together and makes us one. That is really what we are as part of the United Church of Christ. If you look at our crest, it says that they may all be one. Jesus didn't come to say, how many different churches can we create while I'm gone? The whole point is that can we all be one in the body of Christ? And then we have this letter to Timothy. Timothy, the beloved child that we've read about before, that Reverend Bill talked about, and friend of Paul. And many of the Bible folks, Bible commentators, will call this a farewell address that Paul writes to Timothy. We're not really sure when Paul died. We're pretty sure he died under the reign of Nero. Probably was beheaded sometime in the 60s. Not the 1960s, guys, the 60s. But that's all we really know about Paul. But then we have this letter, and we look at it, and there's this phrase, God's Spirit doesn't make us cowards. God's Spirit doesn't make us cowards. And it reminds me of some of the things I was busy about this week. And one of them was to go to USF. Joe and I went representing Faith Family, and we're part of their LGBT History Month celebration kickoff, and they asked us to be there with them. And at the end of it, they asked us if we could come back Wednesday to a meeting, because somebody was coming on campus to speak under the topic of Christianity and homosexuality. And they all thought that this would be a wonderful, positive experience that someone had planned for them during LGBT History Month. And the speaker who's coming preaches her own brand of reparative therapy. And they asked us to be present, and they said, it's 9:30 Wednesday morning. And then someone said to Joe, well, you know, Einstein's will be closed there, we can meet at Einstein's and use their tables and chairs. And Joe says, well, is that meeting in the morning or in the evening then? And they said, oh, it's at night. Now, I'd already committed to it, and he wisely had not. So when we finished our book club here on Wednesday night, we went over to that. We were the only church in Tampa that was in the room with the students. They had one of those tiered lecture halls. I mean, it wasn't gigantic, bigger than this room, and every seat was full. And student after student turned to us and said, thank you for being here, Faith Family. Thank you for being here, Faith Family. If I learned our name. Thank you for being here, Faith Family. And what they did was they were planning what they would do to kind of have a counter, I don't want to say protest, but a kind of a counter experience for folks that would be different from what they would be hearing. And it was so amazing to see the courage in that room of these students. To know they're not like us. They're fearless at 17 and 18 and 19. You know? They're not afraid of staying up till 1 o'clock in the morning. But here's the deal. They weren't concerned about themselves. They were concerned about the folks who would go to that lecture believing that they would hear something that brought hope to them about being gay and a Christian. That's who they were concerned about. And they had all these groups from the university represented. And they stood up and they named themselves and identified themselves and said, you know, we want to do something about this. And one group is going to bring counselors to help people, you know, work through any damage that's done, that they fear will be done. That was the beauty of their message to me. God's Spirit doesn't make cowards of us. It makes us really brave when we see the vulnerable, the questioning students, the timid folks who for the first time in their lives are no longer in a family setting, and maybe they can kind of explore who they are and who God created them as. And there are all these student ambassadors, caregivers that were there with them in mind. And were very clear that they were holding in check their own anger about a situation in which they felt duped by the message that was being put out and the banners that were being put up, and held that in check because it was so much more important to them to be present for the students they feared would be harmed. And at the end of that, there were a number of students, not 15 or 20, but 3 or 4, who came to speak to Mary and me. We were there together. And one young woman had tears streaming down her face the whole time she talked to us, because her family had rejected her. And she couldn't believe there was a church that not only would accept her, would not just tolerate her, but would offer her extravagant welcome and sanctuary. And we hope to see her here one day. And Mary said to her, my retired licensed clinical social worker, would you like a hug? And the young woman, who was probably, I don't know, 18, 19, 20, said, I would love her. Mary hugged her, and I hugged her, and she sobbed as if no one had hugged her in a long, long time. And she said to us, you know, It's not just that I'm part of the LGBT community. It's that I'm African American and my family doesn't accept that for me. And it was very difficult. And yet, for her to know that somebody hugged her, some old cronies, perhaps old crones is a kinder term, old enough to be your grandmothers, hugged her. And we invited her and all of those students here, where there are some other parental types and grandparental types that might embrace these students. Verse 7 in this first chapter of 2 Timothy says, God's Spirit doesn't make cowards of us. But it goes on to say, the Spirit gives us power, love, and self-control. That's what we saw that day in that room. Power, self-empowerment. Not power to abuse with, but the power to love. And the self-control to love. And so I trust when those folks show up here someday, and I'm hoping it's next week because we've invited one of them who is a performance poet to do sharing our gifts for us next week, that they will know here in this house of God, there is a world communion where everyone is welcome. And that God's family can never exclude any of its members, but only grow larger and stronger as we include all of God's family. May that be who we are in this world. May we be those inspired and filled with God's Spirit so that we are not afraid to step up and stand there with the vulnerable, stand there with the young who are still idealistic. Remember, we too were once idealistic.
Very true.
Some of us still are. There's an old saying, if you scratch a cynic, you find an idealist underneath. But let us be those people of courage, those people of the Spirit, that no matter where we are in life and who we encounter, they know that God's love comes from us to them, always, without fail, without end. May I love it. I wasn't sure who was coming through the door. We just said, always, without end, without fail, you are welcome. So, may we all feel welcome in this space. May we all be welcomed and welcoming in this space as God's hands and God's heart. Amen.
Amen.